Okay, for this last section, we have to start thinking about the importance of an evolutionary perspective. When behavior affects survival, and as we'll see, behavior is a very important determinant of survival, then we have to understand that evolution becomes a part of that equation. Now, we're not going to go into an in depth explanation of how evolution works, natural selection, but we need at least a simple primer because an evolutionary perspective becomes very important as we move on. Recall the ultimate versus proximate explanations for behavior. Evolution is where we start to get into those ultimate overarching reasons for why we see a behavior. So, if you have studied any evolutionary biology, then you know about the history with Darwin. Again, we're not going to go too in depth with this, but we need a simple primer. Darwin proposed a few very simple observations that would lead you logically into the idea of evolution, how traits and behaviors may evolve over evolutionary time, why certain things exist, both at the ultimate level and at the proximate level. Why does the hognose snake play dead? How did that behavior come about over evolutionary time? And it ultimately comes down to changes in we'll say allele frequency within a population. We're not going to go that in depth with genetic terminology. We're going to worry about at the level of a trait. Why does this trait exist? How did it develop? And ultimately it comes down to the frequency of that trait across a population. An important thing to keep in mind with evolution is that we're working at the level of a population of animals. We're not working at the level of the individual. We won't go any further into that, but just keep that in mind. Evolution happens at the level of the population. So these simple observations, which you can go out, you can do yourself, you don't need pretty much any scientific background because these are logically obvious when you see them. The first one is excess of offspring. Many animals are able to produce more offspring than they need to replace themselves or to keep the population itself running along smoothly. If you go into evolutionary biology, go into genetics, you know that there is a certain minimum number of individuals within a population to preserve genetic diversity, to preserve the fitness of that population and its ability to persist through time. Many animals can produce a lot more offspring than they need to do that. The result of this in the environment is that it can cause scarcity in resource. When you have a population of animals reproducing much more than they need to in an environment, then the resources in that environment start to become scarce for the individual. And what happens here is that can lead to competition, right? So the idea of excess offspring, it's obvious. We can see that very easily in the environment. We don't need any deeper scientific understanding. And the idea of having more offspring means that, of course, there's going to be competition because resource is limited. Even in the environment, it might seem like a lot of resources are near infinite, but when you start to take in the ecology of the environment, different populations of the same animal, populations of different species all competing for the same resource. And when you're overproducing offspring, that can lead to scarcity, can lead to competition. The competition for resource can dictate who in that population survives. And so this competition, it can place selective pressure on the individuals who are competing for it. There is that popular idea of survival of the fittest, which is kind of misunderstood because we tend to think about survival of the fittest being the biggest and strongest. Survival of the fittest just means there are some who are better at adapting to their environment, better at competition for these resources. So resources for food, resources for territory and habitat, competition for mates. All of these things dictate who is able to survive and reproduce, which is very important. Simply surviving is not enough. To be part of evolution, be part of the evolutionary process, you have to survive and you have to produce viable offspring. Another pretty obvious observation we have about populations of the same species and other species is that there are variations in the traits that any individual has. So the simplest example of that is morphological traits, hair color, eye color, difference in build, difference in body shape. Driver of this variation at the ultimate level, it's mutation, but we're not going to really worry about that. There are things like genetic drift, natural selection, as we'll talk about, gene flow, which changes the unique combinations of traits that any individual has, right? So that simple observation, there is variation in traits between individuals of the same population. So what follows from that idea, along with scarcity in the environment of resource and competition among individuals, is that some individuals will be successful in the competition. Those individuals will produce offspring. Those offspring will have some variation of the traits from their parents. And so the better you are at surviving in the environment, the better you are at competing for these resources, the more your unique set of traits will be passed on to the next generation. And there becomes an overrepresentation of those traits in the next generation. The individuals who fail at competition, the ones who can't survive, can't reproduce, their unique traits, their unique variation of traits, they are lost to the next generation. What follows from these simple observations is this idea of changing frequency of different traits within the whole population as you move down evolutionary time. Every generation is going to have a different frequency of those traits from the previous generation. And that ultimately leads us to the idea of population level gene frequency changes in generations. So when we're talking about traits, ultimately these are controlled by your genetic makeup. We don't want to go too deep into that, just the idea that you're changing the frequency of traits from generation to generation. And this idea of differential survival and reproduction, that's natural selection. There is some kind of environmental constraint that is leading to competition, leading to differential survival, which ultimately leads to changes in trait frequency from generation to generation. Now, in this illustration, we can see a simple example of that. You have a population of field mice, and there are different phenotypes, so there's variation in morphological traits of these mice. Simple example is you have light fur, you have dark fur morphs of these field mice. Same population, they're all interbreeding, same species, but you have these subtle variations. Now, depending on the environment, the field mice will have different levels of successful camouflage within the environment, depending on the flora of your environment. Now, if we introduce a predator into this system, a predator, it's looking for sensory cues that tell it about its prey item. So if it can see that prey item well against the flora backdrop, then it has a better chance of capturing that, a better chance of capturing its prey item. Now we look at these different morphs of field mice. Maybe the dark-furred mouse blends better into the flora because of the color makeup of the flora. So when the predator goes out hunting, it's going to be more successful at capturing the dark morph rather than the light morph, because the dark morph stands out better, or the white morph stands out better against the background. So what we see is predation is putting a selective pressure on this population. And predation, you're removing those animals because they're being eaten. So they're no longer able to survive and reproduce for the next generation. So their unique variation of traits start to disappear. So in the first part of the illustration, 50-50, dark morphs, light morphs. After, predation, next generation comes, and you have, very few of those dark morphs left because the parent generation has been predated upon so heavily. And now you have more and more light fur morphs. And eventually, if you keep seeing this, some of these individual traits can disappear fully from the population. And so, very simple example of how trait frequencies within the population can change depending on simple observations, excess offspring, scarcity of resource in the environment, competition, individual variation, individual fitness, individual ability to be successful in that environment, to reproduce, to survive and reproduce the next generation. This change in trait or gene frequency in the population, that is what Darwin referred to when we were talking about evolution. The changes of gene frequency over evolutionary time, changing a population from its ancestral state to some more derived state. Now, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the time when we're looking at certain traits, when we're trying to understand the form and function of a behavior, the ultimate reasons, the ultimate function of that behavior, where did it come from, why does it exist, we do tend to sometimes ascribe too much importance to a trait. And this is the idea of a lot of students have this kind of teleological thinking about traits, interpreting a trait by its outcome, by what its goal right now is. But we have to keep in mind that not every trait is adaptive. Some traits exist for random reasons. If we go back to the mechanisms of evolution, we have mutation, which is one of the ultimate drivers of evolution, because ultimately, where are you getting changes in genes? Like actual production of new genes, it comes from mutation. But that is not something we're really going to have to worry about in this course. We're worrying about more proximate examples of it. Something like gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. So we talked about natural selection, some kind of selective pressure on the population through predation, through environmental constraints. When we have something like genetic drift results in filtering traits randomly. So in this illustration here of genetic drift, you have different morphs of an insect. You have one that's solid color, you have one that has spots on it. And something happens in the environment, like this looks like lava flow, and you randomly wipe out a section of that population. Now, if you wipe out more individuals of one morph versus the other morph, then the next generation is automatically going to have more of the morph that survived. So you're having a change in trait frequency within the population, but it's a fully random event, which means those traits, there was no selective pressure on those traits to be passed on. There was nothing dictating a differential fitness of the traits. When we see with the light versus dark morphs had a positive selective pressure because they were camouflaged. But with genetic drift, it can be fully random. So the traits that you're left with in the population might not be adaptive. Then something like gene flow, if you have two populations that can interbreed, but they're separated for some reason, maybe ecologically, they're in different areas of the world. You're not having gene flow between them. You're not having reproduction between them. So they can separate slowly. This eventually turns into speciation, where you have the production of new species. We're not going to worry about that. What happens is when you have these populations come back and maybe a few individuals get into these populations and interbreed again, then you're having the flow of genetic information from two separate populations to the other ones. And that can change the allele frequency or the trait frequency. Again, this is not something that is directly related to an adaptive benefit. It's more, again, of a random thing. So with these ideas, the point here is to understand that not every trait, not every behavior we see is necessarily adaptive, necessarily important for the evolution of that animal. It can be fully random or a neutral trait that gets stuck into the population. There are a lot of reasons why a trait might exist. So you have to be careful not to fall into the mistake of saying this trait exists for this reason. We see a lot of examples in biology with evolutionary biologists doing this sometimes. There has been controversies where people ascribe ultimate explanations to traits which may, be fully random like this. I remember there was a popular one years ago about a lab was hypothesizing why your skin gets wrinkly when you're in water too long, and it was something about it was adaptive to be able to better hold on to wet things like wet rocks because you're increasing the surface area, increasing the friction you can get on an object. I think there was some controversy with this because it wasn't really testable and there was a lot of hand waving. So you have to keep in mind when you're trying to interpret something, it may not be there for, an adaptive reason. It may be fully random. Another thing that can happen with a trait that it may have been adaptive in the past, but because of some change, like environmental change, it may no longer be adaptive. So with the example of the different color morphs in field mice, if you have a change in the flora and the environment that prevents, stops the black morph from being more camouflaged and then switches over to having the light morph being more camouflaged, then you've lost the adaptive nature of being a dark morph. And then, with predation, switches over, you're going to have a change in allele frequency again. So there are a lot of things that can change the ultimate explanation for a trait. We have to not make that mistake of ascribing overimportance to a trait. A good example from my own work, when I worked with carpenter bees, we were looking at the evolution of social structure in the bees. And most of you might know about eusociality and honeybees, very complex. We were looking at a very simple type of sociality. Simple parental care, simple nesting together. Now, one of our hypotheses about the evolution of the social behavior in these bees was that there was an environmental constraint that controlled, the evolution of these bees. They, at some point in the past, were very solitary, but now their social structure is a little bit more complex, where they nest together and they have parental care. But the idea was that their nesting substrate, they nest in raspberry twigs. Now, when raspberry is abundant in the environment, then there's lots of habitat substrate for these bees to nest in. But if for some reason the population of raspberry declines, then you start having selective pressure in the environment on communal nesting because there's just not a lot of habitat. So what this means is that any social traits in individuals in this population are going to become adaptive because of this constraint. You're being forced to nest with conspecifics. But if you're forced to nest and you have traits that make you more amicable to nest with, then those traits become more adaptive. So an illustration of an environmental constraint causing the evolution of some kind of behavior, like social behavior. So just keep in mind that not every trait is adaptive. Some are neutral, some are negative, some were adaptive, some have changed. Now let's talk briefly about some of the history of the development of the study of animal behavior, because I think one of the themes with this course is that understanding animal behavior is, fundamentally important for a lot of other fields, especially when you're studying psychology. We're not a singular field that's focused on one single thing. We are an amalgamation of a number of fields through history that have slowly developed into what we now study as animal behavior, starting with comparative psychology, and then development of ethology, development of sociobiology, and then behavioral ecology. All of these different fields, all these different traditions of studying the natural world led into the study of animal behavior. So in the late 1800s, you have Romanes, who started comparative psychology. He was interested in comparing the mental states of animals and humans. So one of the early fields where we start to see properly controlled experimentation dealing with psychology or neuroscience issues. There's a lot of problems. The book goes more in depth, but this field contributed a number of things to what eventually will become the study of animal behavior. Mainly, we start to see interest in learning and cognition comparatively across species. And then with Tinbergen, as we already talked about, him and a few of his colleagues developed the field of ethology. Now, I've been using ethology to mean the study of animal behavior, but there is a difference, at least this classical ethology, where they were interested in looking at behavior within the fully natural environment. No modifications at all, no interaction with the animals, seeing instinct and looking at innate natural behavior in the environment without any kind of manipulation. And then we're not going to talk about Skinner or Watson. You're most likely, I hope you're familiar with them if you've already had your introductory psychology courses. They are part of the history of studying animal behavior. That a lot of their work was very instrumental, not just in psychology and neuroscience, but to the pure study of animal behavior. We're not going to really talk about them for now. Then we see the development of sociobiology, which was developed by E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson is a big name in biology. The book goes more into depth about him and his history a little bit, but the idea of a field where we're worried about the fitness of social evolution specifically. So when I was studying the bees, I was doing sociobiological research, looking at the evolution of social structure in a bee that we thought was in a transitory state from one social structure to another. And then ultimately that leads up to behavioral ecology. So whereas you have ethology looking at species-specific behavior within the natural world, now we're trying to integrate the effects of the natural environment on shaping behavior. So how do ecological conditions shape the behavior of the animal? And again, this harkens back to my story about nest constraint in the bees. That's an environmental constraint shaping the behavior and evolution of social structure in an animal. And ultimately, all of these traditions have added very important methodological and conceptual tools for studying animal behavior. So read that part in the book. It's not something we'll probably be tested on. It's a good idea to have an idea of the history of the development. And the point here is that animal behavior is almost an all-encompassing field. We're integrating neurobiology, physiology, psychology, ecology. All of these different fields come together to give us a more deep understanding, a more robust understanding of the form and function of animal behavior. Now, we need to speak a little bit about the difference in types of experimental methodologies to understand the type of questions you ask dictate the type of experimentation you do. And one of the main facets of such a thing is lab versus field studies. And this will relate back to the examples we have with the study of cockroaches and the study of wolves. One model is better at answering some questions, but some methodologies are also better at asking some questions. So lab versus field studies. If you've done any research yet, if you've volunteered in a lab or you've gone out into the field, you probably don't have any field experience yet because, well, I guess technically clinical experimentation is kind of field. But I mean, my field experience is going out into the bush and looking at bees. So when you're in the lab allows for a more controlled environment. You select a variable of interest, you isolate it, and then you modify it, you observe it, and you quantify something about it. But the point is that you're selecting out a specific variable of interest, controlling everything, and trying to understand something about that variable. Whereas in the field you're looking at natural behavior within an animal's environment. So you're preserving ecological validity, maybe preserving social context, and these different types of methodologies can answer different questions, but you need to understand what you're asking so that you can choose the right methodology. You're looking at control versus realism. And when you don't understand them, that leads to fundamental mistakes with this example of the idea of the alpha and the omega and the sigma in terms of social hierarchies, which we know what effect that had on popular culture, but it all comes from a fundamental mistake in choosing the right methodological context to answer the question you're asking. So I've put the original papers that deal with this. So back in the 40s, a scientist was looking at social hierarchies in wolves, and this original paper, I think it's in German. There's a link there to the English translation. You can look that up. But the idea was he brought a population of wolves into an artificial environment. It wasn't a field study. It was a field lab study. They were in a field, but it wasn't in their specific environment. They brought a whole bunch of random wolves into their field lab study, and then they looked at hierarchical structure. And that's where we get the idea of there being an alpha wolf, there being beta wolves, there being sigma wolves. Problem is this has no ecological context, no real social context, because as we've learned, wolf packs are comprised of family members. They're all basically related animals. So you have a fundamental misunderstanding of how to study something, and that leads to the creation of a cultural phenomenon that is based on bad science. So read these papers if you want. The first paper is basically a book. The second paper goes back and explains the problems with this study. But the point here is that we need to understand that different models, different methodologies can help us answer different questions. So we need to know how to choose the right method, the right model for the question we're looking at. It's especially important when we're asking ultimate versus proximate explanations for behavior. Okay, so the last thing we're going to touch on for this introductory lecture is the idea of the Umwelt, or Umwelt. The idea that all species exist within their own sensory perceptual world, and the idea that they're all basically trapped in that world, like we're trapped in our world. There are certain things we can't sense, certain things we can't process, just like A cuttlefish can't process and sense the same thing. The ultimate point here is we need to understand that animals don't live in the same sensory world that we do. They don't have the same Umwelt that we do. And when you're designing experiments, when you're trying to interpret behaviors, you need to understand the perceptual world that they exist in. While the animals we study may exist within the same physical space as us, their perceptual world can be fundamentally different than ours. And that means that their access to information is going to be different. Their access to different sensory cues are going to be different. The way they process these things are going to be different than what we have. And again, it's the idea of not anthropomorphizing the animals that we study. We have to understand that they are fundamentally different organisms, even though there is the ability for comparison in cognition and specific traits. There is a different perceptual world. And so when we are trying to find an explanation for behavior, when we're trying to interpret behavior, we have to ask what cues are actually available to them and what is meaningful to them. And this ties back to the study of psychology, because things that you're interested in, that we are interested in as psychologists, as psychology students, things like attention, perception, learning, decision making, these are constrained by what can actually be sensed and processed. And so keeping that in mind, we have to understand that cognition cannot be interpreted independently of sensory ecology. I put a list of some common unique ways of sensing the environment that aren't necessarily available to us. Things like the vomeronasal system in snakes. A few examples of sensory cues that we don't have accessible to us. So something like electroception that you see in sharks and platypuses, where they can sense subtle variations in electrical fields. Advanced sensory systems like acoustics in bats and dolphins. Some animals' sensory systems are much more developed than something like ours are. Then you have things like light-based sensory cues. In cuttlefish, you can see polarized light, which gives them a fundamentally different visual world than we have. Same thing with animals that can sense UV light, which we can't. Some animals, like migratory birds, can sense the magnetic field and use that for navigation. Trichobothria, which are very special and highly sensitive sensory hairs that some insects have, like the cockroach from that example, which can sense very small, very subtle variation in air pressure. A lot of this stuff we don't have access to, so their sensory worlds, their Umwelt, is fundamentally different than ours. And over the history of studying animal behavior, studying animal physiology, we keep finding these unique ways of sensing the world, and it changes how we look at studying animals. A good example from my own work, when I was studying psychedelics, I was studying compounds that are classified as psychedelics, but they don't have that psychedelic effect that you get when you take like psilocybin or LSD. It doesn't matter about the point of this, but we needed some way to measure whether or not an animal actually is having a psychedelic effect, maybe having audio and visual hallucinations. How do you do that? Remember, we don't have access to the internal mental world of an animal, so we need kind of proxy behaviors. And so one of these behaviors that we found was showed a good correlation between, dose-dependent psychedelic effects and an actual behavior we could measure, the idea of the head twitch. Give them the psychedelic, and depending on how much psilocybin or LSD or DMT you give them, they show varying amount of a behavior called head twitch, where their head would just intermittently twitch really fast. We didn't always know about this because the head twitch is so fast that we can't actually see that in real time because it happens so fast. So we needed specialized equipment to be able to measure this, to quantify this behavior. In that regard, we had to understand that our perceptual space wasn't adequate to see certain behaviors. So we needed to develop tools. We needed to develop tools to do that for us. That is pretty much it for this introductory lecture. I wanted to introduce you to a number of concepts that we're going to be building on more and more as we move through the course. Things like proximate and ultimate explanations for behavior. Things like the Umwelt, different sensory worlds of animals. Things like selecting the right methodology or the right model to answer the questions you're asking. And relating that all back to the study of psychology and why it's important for you as a psychology student to have a basic biological foundation for the study of behavior, study of animal behavior. Ultimately, animal behavior is a science of explanation. We study actions, but we also study mechanisms, development, function. We look at the history. We use tools taken from psychology and from biology. All of these old traditions that have added something to the overall study of animal behavior. We borrow what allows us to do our job. And we have to remember to try to think about, see the world from the perspective of the subject that we're studying, from the animal. So go through the book, read those sections, just have a good general understanding of the concepts that I've been talking about. And then for the next lecture, we're going to start looking at mechanisms, things like neurobiology, endocrinology, looking at our sensory apparatus and how they all work together to define and shape animal behavior. And so that's it for lecture 1. I'm going to put this up hopefully Sunday, and then second lecture will be up Monday, and then third lecture will be up Tuesday at the latest. Good luck.